Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today I'm joined by philosopher and author Dr. Peter Boghossian. Peter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And you go by Scott?
Yes.
Okay, Scott.
Yes. I have a little bit of a code name, my Scott Veritas name. People know it's not my real name, but that's just because I like to make it as hard as possible for my employer to happen across some of these conversations, and I'll leave it at that. But I'm very excited to talk to you today, Peter. I've been familiar with you for a little while now. I learned about you from the Grievance Studies affair, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to start by asking you a little bit about yourself. My suspicion is that most of the people who listen to this show know at least a little bit about you, but to whatever extent you'd like, if you want to just share a little bit about who you are.
Sure. My name is Peter Boghossian. Who I am in a professional context. I did my dissertation with prison inmates at Columbia River Correctional Institution here in Portland, Oregon. And 80% at the time, I don't know what the statistic is, the figure is today, but 80% of the people at Columbia River, when I did it was an all-male prison, were re-released back into the community. And I looked at the data and I was confident that they were not receiving the programming that they needed. In other words, given the tools that they needed to help them desist from crime. And so I wrote my dissertation and I did a study on whether or not pulling elements from the history of Western intellectual thought and incorporating them into the Socratic method. In other words, teaching inmates to use the Socratic question first with philosophical and moral issues, and then in larger and more specific issues in their lives, if that would help them desist from crime. And so then that was, I don't even know, early 2000s, very early 2000s. And then I've gone on and I've written about conversing and how to have conversations and how to construct meaningful dialogue with people. In fact, I'm writing a book for 8 to 12-year-olds now about exactly that. It's about a young fictionalized historical Socrates who roams the ancient Greek countryside and leads a revolt against the gods, but he does so through the dialectic, through talking, through conversation. Be interesting to see if the book sells. It's kind of a dorky thing, but I taught for years and years critical thinking, moral reasoning, philosophy, and I resigned my position, and now I've started a nonprofit, National Progress Alliance, and I try to push back on illiberal and authoritarian elements in society.
Yeah, there's a lot there that we're going to get into today. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is something that I know you got into fairly recently, I think the last couple of years, which is sort of decoding and translating language from social justice activism. What got you interested in that?
That's a great question. So what got me interested in that, I was reading the actual postmodernists, and even before that, what got me into it is I'm completely convinced that certainly not all, but much of the, many of the, let me frame it like this, many of the issues around difficulties in conversation come because people have different definitions of words. They mean different things by different terms. And so it's not that they have a fundamental disagreement about what outcome they want to have, equity versus equality is a great example of that, or what the nature of justice means, or what is fairness, although that's certainly a component. But the real issue of preventing those conversations is that people mean radically different things by different terms. You saw that in the Atheist Movement with the word faith. And I wrote about that in my first book, and then a manual for creating atheists, and then how to have impossible conversations. I talk about the importance of really making sure that you know what someone means by word. I'll give you a quick example. I do an impossible conversation series where I give people a list. I just set up a bench somewhere. I did one with Reed Nicewonder. His handle is, I think, Cordial Curiosity. He does street epistemology. And I would have conversations with people, and I think it's really important to post the failed conversations. So I post my bad conversations and my failed conversations so that people will learn from those. And one of the thing I learned is I had a conversation with a guy about the importance of borders and between countries, and what he meant by a border and what I meant by a border were totally different things. And as much as I had done this, even such a simple word like that, I didn't take the time to define, and then we got into a quagmire. So with woke terminology in particular, it's been designed to deceive you. It's been designed to make you think it means something other than what it means. And so the first order of business is to clarify those words. So I made a series, Woke in Plain English, where I mean, I've done my homework. I've read the original sources. I've read the materials, et cetera. And I translated what people mean by specific words. And I made that accessible in 60-second videos to people who have no experience whatsoever in critical social justice ideology. Sorry, long answer, but it's
no, that's totally fine. And you feel free to go as long as you need to. I mean, this is very interesting to me because I think the work you're doing here is very important because, as you mentioned, in this instance with the social justice language, there's this intentional attempt on the part of some people that you might call the social justice activists to obfuscate certain terms. I can think of like a million examples. One of the first ones that comes to mind for me is violence or harm, right? There's something where you've completely redefined it for, I'm just going to say, nefarious purposes. I mean, it's used to try and accuse people of committing violence when to anyone, 10, 15 years ago would have plainly not. And unfortunately, you could convince a lot of people these days that they have. I can think of about a billion other examples, but that's just one.
Inclusion is probably the best one. Inclusion is a word that simply does not mean what people think it means. And when they look it up, so it's really interesting. I was in a faculty meeting at the university where I used to teach, I won't name it, and the question of equity, diversity, and inclusion came up about putting that in the department's constitution. And one of the individuals in the meeting said, well, here's what it is in the dictionary. Here's the dictionary definition. Now, there's one of two things can be happening. The person is intentionally obfuscating, to borrow your word, or they're just totally ignorant. In his case, it was just a matter of ignorance. But the word inclusion does not mean what every sane, rational person should want, to include people into a conversation, as opposed to exclude people on the basis of certain immutable characteristics like race or height or weight or what have you. Inclusion, I've explained this so many times, I get tired of it, but inclusion means to have an inclusive space, you have to have a welcoming space. And the way to make people feel welcome is to make sure they're not offended. And people can be offended by certain words and certain language. So an inclusive space means you have to have speech restrictions on the space. That's what inclusion means. It doesn't mean including people of different exogenous characteristics. It means restricting speech. But if you don't know that and you see the word inclusion, you're a parent and you see it come across in an email or on your son or daughter's syllabus in the class, this is an inclusive space, you're going to think, well, no shit, of course who wouldn't want an inclusive space, right? But it doesn't mean what people think they mean. They're hoodwinked by words. And that's why the ideology has gained so much traction. So the first order of business is to just explain in plain language, to translate wokish into English.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that there's always, and this is a really important idea for people to understand, especially in the academic world, there's always the use of these very flowery, nice sounding concepts and words like inclusion, safe space. There's a lot of language that always makes it sound like everything is about, there's sort of an attempt to connect it to civil rights in some way. So for instance, there'll be conversations where, let's say, you've got a person who is questioning gender ideology and they'll say, oh, well, you must be, the article is person is against trans rights. It's always rights is brought in. And when really it's not actually necessarily about people's unalienable rights. It's about the finer details of an ideology. But of course they obfuscate that. And everybody, I say this because in people's minds, they hear rights, anything trans rights. Rights, anything with rights, and they go, that's the good side and the other side is the bad side. So it's this attempt to kind of code people, good, bad, black, white, that thing. And
because we all want to expand the umbrella of rights. And so you're absolutely right. And if anybody wants an anchor point for that, they should read my colleague Kathleen Stock's work. She's a founding faculty at the University of Austin right now, where she talks about that. And you can see that with, turf debates. Everyone's trying to frame the conversation as if the other person is the bad guy, as opposed to actually listening to what someone is saying and then taking it from there. But that's part of the woke ideology. There is no listening to people. And it makes you wonder what percentage of these folks have hoodwinked themselves. And that's probably a rabbit hole we could dig down. But the basic answer to your question is we need to disambiguate these terms disintegrate's a big word, but we need to explain these terms and define them in plain language. And I've done a series of videos. I have these videos truly are. I have Dr. Lyle Asher from Lewis and Clark about how colleges of education became woke. Matt Thornton, who's Conor McGregor's coach's coach. He has a book coming out from Pitchstone Press about violence right now, about these videos about Antifa violence and street violence and what to do. He's called the gift of violence, what to do about that. And so those videos are brief. They're between 60 seconds and 5. Some of them are 6 minutes, but they explain in basic terms what people mean by words, because the only way that you can have a conversation, like I can't have a conversation. I know one word in Hungarian, that's hello, which it means hello. But I can't have a conversation in Hungarian with someone because I don't speak Hungarian if they don't speak English. So the first order of business is to make sure that you're speaking the same language. It seems obvious, but very few people have done it. In fact, nobody's done it as far as I know.
Yeah, I think there was a big missed opportunity when a lot of this language first started to get used. It seemed like not a lot of people were even attempting to kind of break it down and say, hold on a minute, that doesn't necessarily mean what I think it means. If I were to give you a timeline, I'd say, yeah, I started college in 2013. I'm about to turn 27. So I was starting college then. And it seemed like right when I went to college was when a lot of the language started to explode on campus. It was kind of a weird experience for me going from high school to college. But it seemed like there were no attempts made. I don't know if it was because people just hadn't picked up on it yet, or they were too skittish, or it hadn't gone far enough maybe to make them want to kind of combat some of this language. Why do you think it took so long for someone like yourself, and I know there are others involved in these projects, but for people to kind of bear down? It seems like not until, to some extent, 2020, and at least until maybe 2017-ish, not a lot of people were really focused on this type of language and what it actually meant and what it was doing to our institutions like the academy.
You're correct. Like most things in life, there are many different and conflicting reasons for that. One of those is that everybody kept thinking that people are just going to snap out of it. Everyone kept thinking, well, this is just so crazy at this point. There has to be a woke breaking point, or there has to be, racial triaging in medicine. That will never happen, or this will never happen, or the scholarship isn't really corrupted. And I think a lot of it was thinking that this was confined to certain, not even splinter, just rogue, not even rogue, but certain fringe elements in academic departments. And it will never spill out. It will not, there's no way. And so I think it just kept getting more insane over time. And people have kind of translated these words to a certain extent. But I really do think that very few people actually thought that it would be, that our situation would be as bizarre as it is. And then you couple that with other things. There's a crisis of legitimacy in our institutions. Almost all of our venerable institutions, ACLU, SPLC, New York Times. I mean, a lot of these places have become propaganda outlets. So I think it's a combination of things. And then the whole Overton window shifted. In other words, the whole idea of what was previously unthinkable was now normative. And so whether or not people directly participated in the ideology, wokeism, for lack of a better term, I actually think that's a really good term, but they participated, they were in the orbit of the ideology. So they things that were previously so bizarre or morally repugnant as to not contemplate, like segregating people on the basis of their race. We had solved that problem already. Now it's coming in vogue, but this time it's coming in vogue under the banner of the left.
Yeah, what you said really rings true to me about people thinking it was just going to stop. And I heard Brett Weinstein once call it the least satisfying "I told you so" ever, which is how I felt, because for many years I was, and I know you and some of your colleagues were as well. There was a group of people saying this seems like it's headed in one direction. This doesn't seem like it's going to get better unless there's a concerted effort to intervene.
Correct. And that's if I may make my first prediction for you for 2022. I put on my Twitter feed, what are your predictions for 2022? And I had some really interesting, thoughtful responses to that. But one of my predictions in 2022 is that you're going to see epic gaslighting. You will see gaslighting the type that you could, if you think Trump was a gaslighter, nothing compared to what you're going to see. You're going to see all of the people, for example, who vehemently and passionately argued and called everybody names who didn't agree with them, that people born men who self-described as women can go into women's sports. You're going to see them gaslight. I never believe that, not for a second, but you're going to see that with other elements, equity, identity politics, anything with identity level salience. I don't think it's going to change in 2022 in terms of that. We're not going to, I don't know what to call my side, but we're currently losing the culture war, and in not a pretty way. But I think that you're going to see such gaslighting as the ideas fall into ill repute.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen gaslighting. Like, I immediately think of what happened in summer of 2020 when I hear that word. I just, the fact that, and I'm not just referring, by the way, to rioting. I'm actually referring to a broad, what felt like a reckoning and a revolution of, it wasn't just rioting, it was people getting fired for things that I kept reading stories every day about people getting fired. I always think of the professor who was teaching Chinese, and he said a word that kind of maybe sounds like the N-word if you say it really fast.
My kids speak Chinese, and that's insane. Yeah.
That was
the word, but yes.
Yeah, it was the worst one.
And right there, that's okay. So that's two things that popped up, or three things that you said. That first, you said the word riot. It's the conflation of the term protest with riot. And so I was following some local news stations in Portland, and people were clearly rioting. They were clearly destroying property. They were smashing people with hammers. I mean, no ambiguity whatsoever. And consistently, the woke news people would say protesters, the protesters. And so we want protesting. We don't want riots, right? So those terms have a different moral valence. And the second thing you said, what was the second thing you just said?
I was talking about people getting fired, like the professor who was teaching Chinese.
Oh, yes, it's the mention use distinction. And so in philosophy for the longest time, there was a difference between mentioning a term and using the term. And so, but they've collapsed the mention use distinction. So you can't even use the word. See, I can't even say the word now without mentioning, without, in other words, every use of the term, every mention of the term is a use of the term. So if I want to say, what do you, I'm trying to think of one without the obvious, like you can't, I'm trying to think of the one without.
Well, this is a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Talking about.
You should be able to say the words in this context, right?
Right. Because you're not using it. It's not used as a slur against someone. But the idea behind that is, again, it's an attack on systems level thinking. Because remember, the problem in the worldview is that it's always systems level. And I'm a huge Star Trek fan, not to necessarily change the conversation, but boy, Star Trek Discovery is such a it's an abortion of a show. It's like the worst woke nightmare I've ever seen. So one of the episodes in the fourth season, I'm just loyal to the franchise, so I watch. But
I'm a Star Wars guy myself, but you go ahead.
Oh, are you really? Well, you're dead to me, but it is too. But so they go down to this plan. They want to save these prison inmates, and of course, virtually everybody except one person who's shown contrition and is so sorry he did something terrible, but virtually everybody is there because of the system. I mean, they're not there because they actually are rapists and murderers and bad people. It's the system that put them there. And not only does that make bland and trite plot lines, but it retethers you to the idea that you're in the audience watching a show by woke people in 2021, 2022, as opposed to having something really interesting like, wow, they tried to help this person, they trust him, it turns out that he's he's a maniac, and he goes on some killing. But what's interesting to that is this underlying idea of woke ideology that somehow systems, this is Kendi, this is Ta-Nehisi Coates, this is D'Angelo, to name only the popular folks, that somehow the systems, any disparity in outcome is due to the system. So the system must be to blame. And so that's why we have to dismantle, we have to take apart, et cetera, systems. So that gets back to the mention use distinction, and it gets back to why we need to translate these things into language. For example, the difference between homeless and unhoused. So when I was growing up, you used the word bum. And a bum was someone who just didn't want to work. It was a question of laziness. And fortunately, we switched to the term homeless, the person without a home. But now we say the term, now the in term is houseless. It's like similar to the word minoritized. Houseless, the system creates people without houses. So again, all of this stuff always points back to the system. And the idea is that there's structurally within the system is embedded some kind of white supremacy.
Yeah, and the flaws with this kind of thinking, I mean, there's like a million of them, but the first that comes to mind for me is breaking down the whole concept of the individual and individual agency. The fact that you mentioned it doesn't make for very good TV writing is no wonder, because TV is about characters and individuals. When you make it about systems, it can be interesting, but you still have to have individuals with their own agency. And when every character is brought down to they are either oppressed or oppressor, they're a part of this system, you don't get to learn about them as an individual. I'll say that in the Star Wars world, we had the same problem. I mean, it's like everything, it's every other thing you watch on TV these days. It's no wonder it doesn't make for very good TV writing, and it also doesn't make for very good conversation, as I know you've discussed in your work.
It's interesting. A long time ago, I watched Battlestar. I'm a big science fiction fan. I'm a science fiction fanatic, but I watched the new Battlestar Galactica, and I remember I was reading about the episodes online, and everybody was upset that. Did you watch Battlestar Galactica?
I did not.
Well, this will probably be lost, but there was they look like humanoids, and there was a robot, a Cylon, for lack of a better term, and they were bringing all the Cylons down this line in chains because they didn't want them to kill everybody. And the pilot, the main, without going to details, main Cylon, a Cylon just basically murdered this person, so they didn't want to be murdered. And one of the actors who was playing a Cylon was black. And people were outraged that they're bringing the Cylon, and they say, this is a stain on African American. There is no Africa. There is no Africa. There's no America. There is no. These are Cylon. These are characters playing. I mean, even the fact that this has to be explained is kind of crazy. So we've been overtaken by a kind of race essentialism and race madness, and it's not only is it doing nobody any good, but it's actually pushing our society into madness.
Yeah, I know this is language that's a little bit tired, but I do like to frame things in terms of there's war on X. And I feel like there's a war on nuance and a war on thinking to some extent. Because what you just described, I haven't watched the show, but it sounds like, it's like, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, there's nothing to be offended by. But there's a war on that type of critical thinking where you're encouraged to, I always describe it as Bill Burr, the comedian, has a great bit where he says they consulted the chart. And ever since he said that, I was like, oh, I love that. That basically there's this chart of like, did person say this? Did it sound like they were against this or for this? And then they're good or they're bad. And it's a very simplistic script that turns people into, keeping with the theme here, it turns them into kind of robots. Like people, you have this weird experience where you talk to people who they end up, you kind of have these conversations where you're like, I feel like I'm not even talking to like a person. Like I'm not getting any individual zest here. Like I've heard these you've heard certain talking points about 50,000 times if you've tried to have these conversations a certain number of times.
Right. The problem with the idea of consulting the script is that there is no script. And if there were a script, so there's something called a progressive style guide, not the progressive style guide, but a progressive style guide. In other words, it's just one style guide. And interesting, the N word is not in the style guide. I did an event a while ago with Carl Benjamin, known as Sargon of Akkad, at university where I used to teach. And we talked about that. And, like that would be the question, like, how do you adjudicate the meanings of words? Usually you'd go to the dictionary, like for the longest time, and, language is living in terms, young people in particular use words. My daughter just told me something, things change. Like when I grew up, I was taught never to, my shirt should always be tucked in if I have a sweatshirt on top. And every time I go out of the house, she literally physically takes my shirt out. She says, don't do that. Like that's not fashion. Well, she's into fashion. I know literally nothing about fashion, as you can tell by the way I dress. But the point is that these things change over time. And usually we can figure some of these things out because through the dictionary. But the problem is it's like the Motte and the Bailey, right? So you have one definition that's offered, one idea that's out there. And when people realize it's just so fucking crazy, they retreat back. And they just kind of have a defense of that that's very different. That's why we can't. And also, for example, oops, sorry about that. Also, for example, they've changed the meanings of words like racism. So even woke people now control the dictionaries. So you have woke people who have received their education in college, they get out and then they infect with the madness every industry they're in, entertainment, news, sports. But the other problem is sports is a little less so because it's intrinsically a meritocracy to sports, but it's still in sports. That's why, if you're concerned about winning, you can't be concerned about diversity, right? You can only be concerned. Any other variable you add makes it less likely in general that you'll win. Sorry, I just went off on a tangent there. I apologize.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say, I'm almost glad you stopped there because there's a particularly interesting story. For the most part, you're absolutely right with sports. I myself am a football fan. I'm not going to mention my team because then people are going to know exactly where I live. But in any case, I am a football fan. And I don't watch college football, but I heard a story. I'm curious if you heard it, where they had a female place kicker at a college program, and they had her only kick extra points. I don't know if you watch football, but they had her only kick.
Literally nothing.
So they had her only kick super duper short field goals, and then they had like a real kicker who is a man to kick the real field goals that are actually like of a certain length that would be difficult for your average person. And that, I remember, struck me as just so bizarre. It was like a publicity stunt, but I was like, I don't know if it'll ever get that far in the NFL, but it was like, you see these, and also you do see at least sort of the lip service for social justice, particularly in the NFL. They all have these decals on their helmets now that say "End Racism," which I'm always like, you can never end racism. Like, okay, it's a nice thing to aspire to. But
it's funny, those industries have, Melissa Chen made this point, a lot of industries have become woke, but they're not woke in the Middle East. They're not putting, the rainbow banner on their products in Muslim countries. So it's just performative wokeness. But I have just to be clear, I have absolutely no problem if a team wants to have a female kicker or I don't even know what they call, what a midget, the correct term for a midget, a person of short stature or whatever. If they want to have a short person kicking a field goal or dribbling a ball, I have no problem with that. The issue that I think carries salience here, I think there are a few issues, is that in a meritocracy, if the goal is to win and you want to win, then you're going to look for those players, you're going to select your players on the basis of their merit. I mean, it's just like in jiu-jitsu, I don't know if you know anything about jiu-jitsu, but the race of the person it's called rolling, it's like you're wrestling with, is totally irrelevant to the outcome. It's completely skill-based. And so the idea that you would want to take people on with certain racial characteristics would almost definitely only mean that it would increase the likelihood that you'd lose unless you have an equal talent pool. But we know we don't have an equal talent pool. I just heard Jason D. Hill talk about this on Michael Shermer's podcast. There are 10,000 people in the United States with philosophy degrees, and slightly more than 100 PhDs, 100 are African Americans. And so the pool is just smaller. I mean, you can quibble with that statistic, but that doesn't make it less true. So when you draw from a smaller pool, then something has to give, right? So the question should be, instead of thinking about it, that's equity thinking. We should think about it in terms of equality. How do we give everybody a public education of the first rate that enables them to make certain choices? And also, again, back to the three critical race theorists, broadly construed, that I mentioned before, you can't assume that every disparity in outcome is due to systems, which is the fundamental underlying principle of the ideology. It could be due to any one of a number of things. It could be due to culture. It could be due to anything.
Yeah, and as you were kind of alluding to, this ideology, it has a tendency to take certain institutions all the way from the worlds of sports and entertainment to maybe the more kind of inherently vital ones. I mean, you could argue about that, but like the media and the government, and it makes them completely neglect their original purpose. It makes them basically put, and that is something
that's what critical theory does.
Yeah,
that's right. That's critical theory.
Yeah, it strikes me as always particularly bizarre. Like I remember I had a friend in college who was a student journalist, and I talked to him once about like the purpose of being objective in journalism and how you have to have a somewhat neutral, approach to things. And he was telling me how, like, in his view, and this is somebody who's gone on to, I'm not going to say his name, but he's gone on to be actually a professional journalist. And he was talking to me about how it's actually more important to, have a sort of moral crusade, for lack of a better term, when you're doing journalism. And I was like, and this is somebody who, by the way, up until this point had actually been a very objective journalist to my knowledge. It was like he had this switch at one point, and he was basically telling me that objectivity and neutrality isn't important in journalism. And I was like, but that's like the whole concept of like real journalism is that it's informative. And and that's not even the most bizarre example.
So wait a second. So what did he, and then I have another question for you about why you hide where you live. So what did he think the purpose of journalism is? To liberate people from oppression?
No, I don't think he would have framed it exactly that way. I think he would have framed it, I can't remember exactly what he said, but I think it was something to the extent of like, it is to publish things that make society better. That's my most charitable interpretation, right? I'm trying to not go with the generic, is to just say things that, this is the important part. It's to say things that make society better, even if they're not necessarily true.
Okay, well, that's fine. I have no problem with that as long as he puts that right in the beginning. Don't take this as true. I want to make society better. I'm not a journalist. I'm just somebody who wants to make society better. I'm not reporting on anything. I'm a fiction writer.
Yeah. Well, he probably would have taken issue with, I was trying to be charitable, but even, then he definitely wanted to have his cake and eat it too. Because he'd be like, he was a big believer in journalists or agents of truth. And I had conversations with him about that.
That's kind of interesting. So every night before I go to bed, I watch TV, almost always science fiction, but I've been trying to branch out a little bit, but I've noticed something since about, 2017, maybe 2018. Every time there's anything sexual at all in a film or TV or movie, what have you, always, it is the woman who initiates. I don't think I've seen a single thing, movie, TV show, what have you, in which the man initiated. The first kiss, for example. And I think it's the same thing about your friend, kind of, that's not the way reality is. But that's a kind of a nice story that maybe makes people feel good but the difference in that case is that they're movies and television shows, right? They're not, especially if you go in the realm of fantasy and science fiction. But again, those things capture the zeitgeist of the age, the spirit of our times are encapsulated in that. It's the other reason why Star Trek is so disappointing to me, this discovery, but I won't talk about that anymore. But so your friend is more of a fiction writer than he is a journalist, which is fine. He just should say he's a fiction writer.
Yeah, well, that's my whole thing, is that people, they always want to have their cake and eat it too. They always try to act like they want all of the authority and credibility that comes with the position they're in. But then the second that they have to back that up by doing the thing that is implied, right? By being a journalist, by being a governor, by being a professor. The second that they are asked to do like the hard part, like telling the truth or whatever it might be, they immediately go like, oh, I don't want that part. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And so if you look at that at a systems level, for example, in an academic context, which I'm thinking, you have places like Bob Jones University, which is an explicitly Christian university. They make not only do they not hide it, they advertise it from the rooftops. Like they're screaming about Jesus and the resurrection, and all the faculty have to sign, or Liberty University, they also have to sign pledges of faith. George Fox is another one where they sign pledges of faith. The difference is that the corruption that we're now seeing in our academic institutions, they masquerade as educational, but they're not educational. They have an entirely different mission. The president of Portland State University, just to use one example, said that the highest, and please cite me on this, or look for it online. I don't want people to say that I'm making it up. So please, the highest priority of the institution is racial justice. Really? The highest? The highest, not top 100. Not budgets, not teaching excellence, not publication record. And every time I've wanted to have a conversation about this, the only people who will have, Melissa Chen just tweeted about this today, the only person who will have me on are conservative media, right? Nobody on the left wants that. It's not a gotcha. You can even give them a question beforehand. Should racial justice be the highest priority of a public educational institution? It's a simple question. And frankly, when you're a taxpayer, that's a question that demands to be talked about. But part of the game that we see being played is the left won't have you on to have that conversation about race or race consciousness or racial segregation or inclusion or any of the suite of factors that go into the ideology. And so when I go on Gutfield or when I go on Tucker Carlson, when I have people say, well, you're really a right-wing maniac, you only go on to right-wing shows. But the only reason we go on to right-wing shows is because the left wing won't, no one on the left, with the one exception of David Pakman, nobody on the left will have us on. So we go on and then it's very easy to say, well, look, you're on the left. Well, that's just, I mean, look, you're on the right because you've gone all these. No, that's just not true. I will have look, your lodestar should be, can I speak freely about things? Can I contradict the narrative? Can I go on and say what I think on the basis of the best available evidence that I have? And am I willing to change my mind? And if the answer to that is yes, you should go on anybody's show you want to go on. And there, this idea that we have now that not only is there deplatforming, so, this guy's been on, Tucker Carlson or Fox, makes it more difficult if you're like my friend, the philosopher Jason D. Hill, who's a Black, gay immigrant. I don't think he's a conservative, he's a Christian. It makes it more difficult for them to deplatform him. But then they say, well, he's not really Black. Right? They say, well, because only so it's like the whole Biden thing. Well, you voted for Trump, you're not really Black, right? So the idea that because of your racial characteristic, you have to think a certain way, you have to believe a certain way. This is the United States of America. You can believe anything you want to believe. In fact, people have bizarre beliefs all the time. And for you to tell somebody else that because they're Black, they have to believe a certain way, that's like a form. Not only is that a form of derangement, that's the antithesis of what this country was founded on, liberty.
And it is racist.
Anything they want. It's totally racist. It's totally racist, but it's racist. I would term it neo-racist as a foundation against tolerism and racism. It's neo-racist. And the thing is, they're trying to pick up the banner of the civil rights movement and say, look, we're not the real racists. It's yet another example of becoming what you hate.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that term neo-racism. I do want to ask you a little bit more about the terminology that is used in these instances, namely, and I think you did touch on this earlier, the term itself, wokeness or woke ideology. It seems to be the term that has stuck to describe this ideology that is discussed so much by people like you and myself, even though people have tried to give it many other names. I remember when Dave Rubin was talking about the regressive left, Jordan Peterson talks about, I know it's
Majid Nawaz's term initially, but
yeah, that's right. Majid Nawaz, you are, I remember that. He was first. And then, and then some people, I know it's not exactly the same thing, but you hear Jordan Peterson talk about postmodern neo-Marxism. Some people just say socialism. There's like all these different words. Wokeness is the one that
Helen Pluckrose uses in cynical theories critical social justice. Neo-Marxism is another one. Yeah. So there are different. Andrew Doyle, Tatiana McGrath, who Great Britain News has some great stuff on that. And I, up until recently, that was the term the woke themselves used. Now they're kind of attempting to repudiate that term or disassociate themselves with it. But it's really the best idea is you've kind of woken up to injustice. But the other reason I like it is it has a born again element to it. It has, the more woke one is, the more one realizes that one isn't woke enough.
Would you describe wokeness as a religion?
Yes. I think that James, not to play the, who's the hipster of this, I think James Lindsay and I were the first ones who came out with that.
You guys were early, I think, yeah.
I think we were the first when we published a piece in Allthink called "Privilege is the Original Sin," and we talked about how wokeness is a religion. McWhorter's wonderful new book talks about that. Now it's pretty much everybody realizes it's a religion, except the people who participate in it. And my prediction is that they too, at some point, particularly since there are so many atheists who participate in the new religion, and I've written about this pretty extensively. I've talked about it, public talks, podcasts, et cetera, extensively. I think that one of the things that we're going to see happen is that people, have you heard of the substitution hypothesis?
I might have heard of it. I don't know what it is.
So it's the idea that people need something to believe. And so
Yep.
as Christianity declined, Clay Rutledge, psychologist, has
I was actually going to ask you about this. I didn't know what it was called, but I was going to ask you. Oh, please proceed.
yeah. So as traditional religions, particularly Christianity, has declined in the West, that has to be substituted with something, because the
Yes.
state's the point, right? We all have, so it can't just be we lose, the brain is the hardware, the software is what comes in. It can't just be that we lose one superstition. We have to kind of latch on to another set of exogenous values that parasitize. That's what Gadsad's book is about. Talks about that a little bit, and then writes about the parasitic mind. But that idea of parasitizing is very good, but it's a substitution. It substitutes one set of beliefs. It's like in the Game of Thrones, why you have the old religion, the old gods. You only have new gods because people start believing in the old gods. And so one of the things that you see happening now is, and there, people who would normally be close bedfellows have significant disagreements on whether or not the substitution hypothesis is true. I'm tending to think it is at the moment.
Yeah, I actually, thank you for saying the name of it, because I was going to ask you about this exact phenomenon. I've definitely heard Douglas Murray put it into words a number of times. He's a thinker that has asserted it many times. I know there's many thinkers who have, but I remember hearing it for the first time from him. Basically the idea that it's almost like, the way I thought of it initially is like, oh, politics is the new religion. Where has this sort of obsessive political activism in everyday people came from? And it reminded me of religion. And then I realized I'm sort of curious, as an atheist, and for what it's worth, I'm an atheist as well. I know you've written a book about atheism. Have you reflected at all on maybe the impact that the atheist movement circa, let's say like 2010, 2011, might have had on the future of, for lack of a better term, the culture war, the social justice takeover?
Oh yeah, no question at all. It was a canary in a coal mine. The social justice movement, the woke movement, whatever you want to call it. We'll just call it woke, so we'll have the lingua franca here. They destroyed the skeptic movement. They totally destroyed the atheist movement. And I think now you see that in the Southern Baptist conventions. You see that really throughout all of Christendom. You see that in just about everything. And so I published a piece about that for the American Mind. The Great Realignment, Culture War 2.0. And in this culture war, what was important before about atheism, the metaphysical, people walking on water, entities out there, that's not important anymore. Other things are important, like the view of truth you have. Is truth subjective or is truth objective? Can you come to know it? The correspondence theory of truth, or what are the rules of engagement is another idea. Like if I disagree with somebody, I'm going to have a conversation with Rod Dreher when we go to Hungary pretty soon. And Rob's a very conservative Orthodox Christian. He wrote Live Not by Lies. But we know going into that, we know what the rules are. We can disagree on anything we want. I'm not going to punch him in the head. I'm not going to accuse him of being a racist or a rapist or a Nazi. I mean, we have an agreement on the rules. We might disagree on the content. And I think that's one of the key characteristics of Culture War 2.0 is that we have a fundamental, we know how to adjudicate disputes, right? I just threw out a lot there, so I'll pause.
No, no problem. I'm glad that we're talking about this. It's something I wanted to discuss, but I kind of want to bring it back a little bit and just ask you, because you're obviously, you've talked about how the atheist movement was the canary in the coal mine. I'm curious why you think it presented itself as somewhat of a soft target for this ideology, because it's almost like proto wokeness, what we're talking about. It was so long ago. A lot of people would just call it feminism at the time, and there are reasons for that because feminism was an important part of it. But why do you think it sort of presented itself as a soft target so early on in the sort of spread of wokeness? I mean, 2010 is early on that timeline, if we're talking about that period.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it at, not to parse too fine of a hair, but I'd put it at 2012. I'd put it on when DJ Grote was attacked at the Skeptical Conference. I remember that because I gave a talk on authenticity that I was there. In fact, you mentioned Douglas Murray. I just spoke to Douglas Murray this morning. He's going to be on Gutfeld's show, and he both in the Madness of Crowds and Long Slow Death of Europe, which are two fantastic books that I can't recommend enough. you see the elements of that, and he does an extraordinary, Douglas is an amazing writer, does an extraordinary job of capturing that in language and translating it. I think part of the reason, to answer your question directly, is that many of the people, I can't prove this, but I would think most of the people who were heavily involved in the atheist movement, in particular, less so the skeptical movement, did so because they saw injustices that religion had done, particularly around social justice issues, sexuality, etc. And so they were attracted to that movement as a way to stop those injustices. That's why right now, referencing the Culture War 2.0 piece again, that's why so there were then two camps. So I'm going to try to explicate this. If this is unclear, let me know and I'll stop, okay? I'll try to do a better job of explaining. Okay, so before you had atheists and you had Christians, and then within that umbrella, you had basically believers, but more or less in this country, it was you had atheists and you had Christians. Culture War 2.0 comes along, and the schism, the fault line is wokeness, right? Identitarian concerns. The stronger the identity level salience, the more relevant something is. So then you had the atheist movement split into not conservative atheists. This is very, very important, because there are almost no conservative atheists, and we could talk about why that is in a second. But you had the atheist movement split to woke atheists and non-woke atheists. And you had the Christianity is now seeing a split a little later, but it's truly in the middle of the split. Woke Christians and non-woke Christians. And what's super interesting about this is that the fault lines, if you were to draw lines, it'd be much easier if I had a blackboard, but the woke Christians and woke atheists are much closer to each other than atheists are, non-woke atheists are woke atheists, or even Christians, non-woke Christians to Christians. I'm much closer to even conservative Christians than I am woke atheists. And that's because while I recognize their belief system in terms of metaphysics is, to me, bizarre and almost definitely false. To me, that is not a grounding principle of the relationship. They don't want to rob me of my cognitive liberty. They don't want to tell me what to believe. In fact, the whole idea is that you have to choose Jesus, right? You have to make the decision. You can't be born into it. But what happens is that makes them for some very unusual bedfellows. And the way that many woke atheists try to combat this is, again, what I said before. They'll say, well, you're just a conservative. But that's not true. It's like Steven Pinker calls it the left pole. And Colin Wright has a nice little diagram of, he didn't change his beliefs, but the left went crazy, right? The left literally took out ahistorical ideas about race, gender, et cetera. They switched from talking about economic privilege to talking about race and gender privilege and sexuality privilege, so that there was not an inversion, but a flipping. But anyway, that idea of thinking about woke Christians, anti-woke Christians, woke atheists, anti-woke atheists, and how the anti-woke atheists are closer in most circumstances. The exception to that is if somebody is still caught in Culture War 1.0. I found many people who are hardcore delusional Christians, if they're still caught in Culture War 1.0, they can't even think that way. And part of the reason for that delusion is, what they don't understand is, if the anti-woke atheists lose, then they lose. Right? That's a huge point. Is that clear?
Yes. No, I follow completely everything that you were saying. And by the way, it rings true to me in part because I remember experiencing it myself, kind of that crack up. I was just like I was a young, edgy atheist. I was in high school during all of that, so at the 2012-ish period. But I remember the crack up very particularly, and how it kind of, played out over social media and on the internet.
Right.
And sort of seeing it play out from there. What you said was extremely clear to me, and I'm guessing it's clear to my audience.
So let's go back and talk about that one last point for a second. If the anti-woke atheists like me, if we lose the thing that the Christians caught in culture war 1.0 don't understand is that they will lose, their ability. I think that their beliefs are false, but I mean, to me, they're clearly false. But I think it is utterly essential in the United States, and I really believe this is a universal value, that people should be able to believe anything they want to believe. People should be able to pray any way they want to pray. There are exceptions to that, obviously, but bracketing that for a second. And so I want their cognitive liberty as much as I want my own. That's the promise of secularism, right? Or that's what secularism is. It allows different people to coexist in spaces with different people having their own beliefs. I want the freedom to challenge those people's religious beliefs. I want them to have the freedom to walk away and tell me to fuck you and not answer me. And I want them to challenge my atheism, and to borrow a turn of phrase from Christians in good faith, I want them to challenge me to debates. I want them to have conversations with me, et cetera, et cetera. What I don't want is a totalitarian force telling me what I can believe and I can't believe, and what people who don't believe the things that I do, like religious people, that they have to subordinate their beliefs to some other religion, the social justice ideology.
Yeah, and it's very, very interesting the extent to which, because of what you were just describing, you've been able to make common cause with people that you definitely wouldn't have in the year 2011. This coalition that has emerged, you described them as strange bedfellows. They most certainly are. It has been kind of strange and also beautiful to watch for the past 5 years in particular, and also the past 10 years, to see a coalition kind of emerge that is against this unique form of unreason, which of course was the whole thing initially, was, atheists saying that Christians are unreasonable, Christians saying atheists are unreasonable. But now there's sort of this new, what you're saying is culture war 2.0 that has emerged and created this new coalition. I really want to ask you though about the fact that it seems like within that coalition of the people who do understand, they're on culture war 2.0. They have the basic plot correct. And there's this, for lack of a better term, up until recently, it might have been referred to as the intellectual dark web, or I like to say heterodox coalition or whatever. That coalition, it seems like there are some divisions outside of religion, sort of the old dividing lines. There are very strong divisions that have emerged in that cohort in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. It seemed like there was a lot of metaphorically, I was hugging and kissing in 2017, 2018, people shaking hands, being like, let's break bread and kind of bring this coalition together. And it's been very fractured in the past 2 years in particular. I think COVID is a part of that. I think Trump was inevitably a part of that. We don't have to talk about Trump any more than you want to.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's that we could just mention it the one time and then we don't have to say that word for the rest of the show. But, I'm just curious what you make of these divisions as they have appeared over the course of the past 2 years within the, let's just say, intellectual dark web, and what you think maybe the solutions are to create a more unified front against wokeness in that space.
Boy, that's a great, very, very complicated question. I think it's best to start off, and tell me if you don't want me to do this, but I think it's best to answer the question to start off with what the divisions are.
Go right ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I just think that would just help clarify things. So part of the division was about, of course, COVID and vaccines and how seriousness, Neil Ferguson talks about this in his book Doom, but he doesn't mention the IDW. So for example, you have Brett and Sam Harris on different sides about vaccinations, about, I didn't even want to call them alternative therapies, but potential treatments, let's say that's perhaps better. So that was a big sticking point. And then you had, in fact, I think that was the biggest sticking point, or the biggest point of contention. And you had a lot of other smaller issues around which the inevitable divisions, because remember, they had no unifying political conclusions. They just agreed upon processes. We need, really, frankly, things that are so basic and kind of obvious, you really just shouldn't even need any name for it. Like, we need freedom of speech. Well, okay. if we lived in a sane world, nobody would deny that, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, or maybe definitely the movement, at least in part, arose because we don't live in a sane world, and because speech rights and freedoms are under attack. Due process was under attack. The basic elements of the meritocracy were under attack. Democracy was under attack. And so you had a loose coalition of people who were not necessarily conservatives. Michael Shermer did a piece on this with some actual data about the number of people who were in the IDW who self-identifies as conservative or liberal, what have you. Personally, I've never viewed myself as a member or not a member. I think the whole idea is kind of silly. I just do my own thing. I just move my own. If I think something is true, that's why I wrote the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, because we're not talking to each other. Whether or not that happens to fill in with some larger ideological movement, that's fine. But anyway, basically, so we had these divisions around, mostly the most acrimonious were around the vaccine and treatments for the vaccine and COVID. And then from there, those divisions really became pretty hardcore splits. And I don't follow the internal politics. I'm too busy waging a culture war. But from my understanding, those divisions have been less than polite.
Yeah, they've spilled over onto social media in ways that, from my perspective, as somebody who, I was starting intellectual dark web meetups in my home city, which, by the way, were great. And I made lots of really great friends from those. And so I had a lot of affection for the intellectual dark web as a concept. I understood that it was this loosely affiliated thing.
Like Claire Lehman, right?
Yeah.
Lehman, I don't know how you pronounce her name, but from Quillette, so she's been going after a lot of people. That other reporter, Kathy, somebody, I can't remember her name, other people. Again, I don't necessarily see the point. Like, I look at that from the outside, and I understand people have disagreements, and I think we're so fractured already. I don't really see the point of why we would want to pick yet more fights with people. I think what we should be doing is reaching across the aisle and trying to find commonality and humanity. Like, that's the foundation against intolerance and racism, right? That's the whole, raison d'etre. That's the whole thrust. And finding people who look, you can agree with someone about 95% or 99%, 98%, the high 90s. But there'll be one point of disagreement that you'll just find so ghastly that you can't have a relationship with them. By the way, do you ever watch Babylon 5?
No.
Oh, you're dead to me. Well, there's a great scene in there. There's a great scene in there. And it was a wonderful show, brilliant science fiction show, wonderful show in which one of the characters, Veer, falls in love with this woman, and she's like perfect in every conceivable way, except that she's a genocidal maniac. She wants to kill all the Narn. But the idea is that, yes, there are lines that can be crossed, but and so every relationship, Christopher Hitchens used to talk about this. If someone doesn't pay a parking ticket, that's one thing. But if someone's like molesting little kids at Costco, that's a whole another thing. So I don't know why I said Costco, but wherever. So I think that what I would like to see more of and less of, I would like to see more reaching across divides to people, and more, if you do have a concern or an issue, you take it offline and you try to talk to the people, not in 240 characters, but you try to have a substantive discussion. And if you can't do that, okay, great. Then maybe you have a conversation on stage in front of an audience. I mean, there are a lot of ways to deal with it, but what we need now, in my opinion, is we're so divided, and people are actually talking. I never thought in my life, I'm 55, I would hear this. People are talking about a national divorce. And I was looking at, basically breaking the country up. And I was looking at migration, and people have moved out of California. Is the number one spot they moved out of. And then they've moved into, you can probably guess, the red states, Texas and Florida. I think Arizona was third on the list. But the idea is that we're doing exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, having friends of different faith traditions, having friends of different political orientations, even metaphysical orientations. That's why, again, I mentioned Rob Dreher, who's an Orthodox Christian, who, I've become very friendly with. And Phil Vischer is another friend of mine, the guy from VeggieTales. I just, wished him a Merry Christmas the other day, or Happy New Year. But I think that the idea is that it would be, if we don't want this place to look like Iraq, then one of the things that we should be doing is we should be trying to reach across to people who have not 3% or 5% of beliefs different from ours, but exactly the opposite, the inverse of that. 3% of the beliefs that are same. We should be trying to find commonality with those people.
Yeah, I vehemently agree with you, Peter, and I hope to see more of that in the future. I know we had about an hour, so I think that's a really great place to end it. I do want to ask you two more things that will be really, really quick. One is, do you watch The Expanse? I want to see if we have maybe one show in common. Okay, we got one.
I love The Expanse. I'm very, very impressed by The Expanse. I thought they did the main guy does jujitsu too, but I thought with a buddy of mine. But I think in Georgia. But yeah, I think The Expanse is a terrific show. There are not really many deep space shows. In fact, it's the only one that I know of that's on right now. It's a great show.
Yeah, my girlfriend and I are going to be starting the last season in the next couple of days. I wanted to see if we could get one show in common, and we did. So
have you watched Invasion on Apple TV?
No.
Do you have Apple TV?
I don't think I do.
Oh. It is genuinely, it's one of the best sci-fi shows in the last decade. It's what the kids call a slow burn. So instead of like, there's the alien ship, we know, like nobody has it's very realistic who knows what realistic is, because you don't know, but it's how one would imagine that there would actually be an alien invasion. Like, you wouldn't have any idea what was going on, like no idea whatsoever, but it's good. I recommend it. But yeah, Expanse, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, that's a favorite of mine. I'll have to check out that Invasion show as well. Thank you so much for being on the show, Peter. Anything you want to plug or promote while you're here in the last few minutes?
Yeah, my Twitter is @Peter Boghossian, Boghossin. I'm doing a 10 to 20 university tour, hopefully 20. I have an Indiegogo fundraiser for that. It's a reverse Q&A tour. You can watch that. The initial reverse Q&A about social justice I did at Portland State. I have an unbelievably full year. I'll be working at the University of Austin in June. I'll be going to Hungary for a couple of months. I'll be traveling around. I'm pretty excited about this year. It's an amazing year of opportunity. So yeah, appreciate it.
Everyone be sure to check that stuff out. And if you don't already follow Peter on Twitter, please do. Thanks for being on the show again, Peter. And thanks to everyone for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, 5-star review. You guys know the drill. Thanks for listening to the Veritas podcast. I'll see you next time.